Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first talk of CFPR seminar series for the year 2022. So happy New Year. So today we meet slightly earlier because our distinguished speaker, Professor Monica Dasgupta, is joining us from the US Eastern Time Zone. So it's quite late for her, so we are very grateful for this opportunity and for her willingness to spend time with our CFPR community. So Professor Dasgupta is a research professor in the Department of Sociology and the Maryland Population Research Center at the University of Maryland College Park. So prior to joining Maryland, she held positions at the World Bank, at Harvard University, and at the Center for Population, at the National Council of Applied Economic Research in New Delhi. So Professor Dasgupta is widely known internationally for her work on population, poverty, and development. So based on village level research, she has studied how family systems shape maternal and child health outcomes and son preference in different parts of Asia. So more recently, she has studied how public health system can reduce a population exposure to disease. And this includes studying the institutional design of successful models of low-cost preventive public health system in developing countries. So she's currently working on the implications of China marriage squeeze for the social protection needs of future aging bachelor. So today, Professor Dasgupta will share with us one of her research projects, which is titled Son Preference and Missing Girls in Asia, What Drives It and What Might Help Reduce It, Lessons from South Korea. So without further ado, please let me now hand over to Professor Dasgupta. And for audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type your question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So we'll go through them during the Q&A. So Prof, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's really exciting to be part of this seminar series that you organize, because you're slap in the center of Asia, and I can see that from all the names on the screen. It's a fantastic opportunity, and you guys make such a good job of using that opportunity. So let me share screen. Right, so I'll be talking about son preference in different parts of Asia, what drives it, and what might help reduce it. And I'll wind up with lessons from South Korea, which is the first country to have shifted from son preference to normal sex ratios at birth and a preference for daughters now, though they're not sex selecting to have daughters. They do have a very clear stated preference for daughters. So the drivers of sex selection, I expect this will be very familiar to this audience, so I won't talk about it very much. Whether the drivers are primarily economic or cultural. Then I'll talk about what exacerbates sex selection in a particular setting. And briefly, it's exacerbated by obviously new technologies that make it easier to sex select, but also by a changed atmosphere of risk facing parents. And in terms of what reduces sex selection, I'll talk about specific policies that help and broader social changes that help. And then I'll talk about the insights from South Korea's shift from very strong son preference to daughter preference. So the drivers of son preference. Daughters pretty much around the world offer lower economic returns than sons. Women's earning capacity is limited. In pre-industrial societies, it's limited because land ownership is frequently passed through the fathers to the son. So men inherit the land, which is the main productive resource, and women don't have ownership access to that. In industrialized societies, we're very familiar about the fact that women are handicapped in their earnings trajectory by childbearing, domestic work burdens, and by choices to which they're steered by the education system, by their parents, etc., to choose things which are considered more suitable for women and typically pay less. So since daughters typically offer lower economic returns than sons, why do we not find sex selection everywhere? Why do we only find it in certain settings? And this is essentially because
now, instead of reacting,
should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. Basically, the patrilineal family was very widespread in the pre-industrial world, but they differ quite a lot from the extent to which adult daughters are excluded from helping their parents. Most pre-industrial systems offered some scope for helping parents. For example, if there were no brothers, they could inherit land or they could remain single in their parents' home. And this was fairly common in large parts of pre-industrial Europe and in Japan. So in those settings, you get a mild son preference. But if in a few settings, daughters are rigidly excluded from helping their parents. They have to marry and then they have to take care of their husband and his parents. And this is the pattern that's found in literally all the societies that manifest strong sex selection, because this pattern generates a strong preference for boys. If you can't rely on girls in your old age, you obviously will want to have boys. And this family pattern actually had a lot of advantages in the pre-industrial period because they functioned as corporate units and they were effective for managing and protecting people before the modern state was established. So within a given setting, what exacerbates sex selection? We know that new technologies make it easier to get rid of unwanted girls. So what you see here is that at parities 3 and 4, with the new technologies coming in, the sex ratio at birth in South Korea shot up in 1982 from this level up to these very astronomical levels in 1989 because of the availability of sex-selective technology. But risk is a very important factor as well, which gets less attention. What we see here is China, birth cohorts from 1920 to 1990. And these are the estimated proportions of women missing. You see with the internal wars in China, sex selection started rising. Then with the Japanese invasion, it went through the roof. Then the communist government took over, it came right down. And even with a huge adverse event like the Great Leap Famine, it increased only a little bit. And then you got not only the one-child policy, but the communes were dismantled. So people were no longer able to basically rely on the collectivity, on the commune for their livelihood. They had to rely on themselves and their own households from here onwards. What you see here is a comparison of North Korea and South Korea, sex ratio by birth cohort, and you see that the familiar pattern in South Korea, it went through the roof and came back down, whereas in North Korea, it remained pretty normal throughout. So although people were much poorer in North Korea than in South Korea, the fact that they cannot mitigate risk through their own efforts. They depend on the collectivity for their livelihood. And so sons have no particular advantage over daughters. You find the same thing in the South Caucasus countries when the USSR was dissolved and communes were dissolved overnight. This is fairly normal sex ratios, child sex ratios, before the USSR was dissolved, and this is the first census after the dissolution of the USSR. So sex ratios went through the roof. It's the same pattern you're seeing in different settings, that when communes are dissolved, sex ratios go up. So now I'll turn to this third section to talk about what helps reduce sex selection. Specific policies have been tried, direct policies, such as banning prenatal sex detection or sex-selective abortion, and conditional cash transfers, which basically offer people financial incentives to raise daughters. These direct policies are largely quite complex to implement, and there's limited evidence of impact. With the bans, you find that although all these countries, China, South Korea, and India, had bans, the proportions of girls missing have continued to climb steeply. Financial incentives for local health staff in India did improve sex ratios at birth, but this was partially offset by higher postnatal mortality of girls. This is a recent paper by Javadekar and Saxena. So it's that trade-off between prenatal sex selection and postnatal sex selection. If they're prevented from prenatal sex selection, some parents will resort to postnatal sex selection. And what's very interesting is that in China in the mid-2000s, there was the Care for Girls program, and part of that was very stringent efforts to tighten implementation of the ban on sex selection. And this is something that had a huge amount of political pressure behind it. A lot of ministries were involved. They did everything they could think of, which, you know, there were all kinds of punishments for people caught performing sex selection. And they had their family planning workers, which, as you know, in China, there's a density of family planning workers at the local level. They had them follow women, the women who were expecting their second child, because that's typically when sex selection used to take place. Because for most women in China, if the first child was a girl, they were allowed to have a second child. So they were following the second birth to prevent sex selection. They were following these women through their pregnancy. And what you basically find is that what they did was successful in terms of the local family planning workers managed to bring down sharply the sex selection of the second births. But what people did was they shifted to sex selecting at first birth. And as a result, the overall sex ratio at birth was basically stable between 2000 and 2010, which means that all those efforts to punish doctors and clinics for performing sex selection had very little effect, because you got the similar levels of sex selection, but you got a change in the pattern of sex selection because the local family planning workers were effective at changing the pattern that they were asked to work on. Financial incentives to raise girls, there's nothing new about it. There's this very nice archival study that Hu published in 1948, in which, amongst other things, he mentions that lineages in Jiangsu province in the 19th century offered financial incentives to their households to raise girls. In India, there's been a lot of efforts to have programs that offer poor households financial incentives to raise a daughter. Evaluations show at best a modest impact on child sex ratios. And there are a number of problems with implementing these programs, administrative problems, but also the fundamental problem with these programs is that raising a daughter to adulthood is expensive, and small cash incentives are really not going to do a very great deal. Compensating a family for the full cost of raising a child to adulthood is a whole different kettle of fish. Also, it gives a kind of a strange signal that the government feels that people need to be compensated for having a girl. Similarly, China's Care for Girls policy, they had at province level different programs which tried to make it easier for parents with girls, whether in terms of access to education, in some cases, a little bit of help with old age support and so on. There's, as far as I know, no formal evaluation of this yet. Then you get policies to reduce sex selection, indirect policies. And there's a lot of these which have been used in all these settings. Some policies increase the potential value of girls, and these are laws for gender equity, whether it's access to education, whether it's making for equal inheritance between girls and boys, or ensuring greater political participation by women. These laws basically make it easier for females to be full members of society and to be more valuable to their parents in principle. The other thing that happens a lot is mass media advocacy. It's been used through all these countries, throughout Asia, heavily for family planning, and in countries where there was sex selection, where there was strong son preference, the mass media advocacy heavily promoted the idea that it doesn't matter whether you have a son or a daughter. In a whole range of different behaviors, whether it's health behaviors, family planning, adoption, fertility desires, or even voting patterns as they find in the US, mass media advocacy has huge impact. And these things can be done. These laws in mass media can be done in relatively poor settings. Then in settings which are a little better off, one can go for risk reduction, which lowers the financial dependence of parents on their children. There's been a wide range of efforts to expand pensions outside of formal employment. And these have been shown to have some impact. Ebenstein and Long in their 2010 paper found some impact in China. And Ebenstein more recently has looked at a whole bunch of different countries, including China and South Korea. And he finds that these have some impact on gender preferences for children. And the other thing is social insurance. If people have access to health coverage, it lowers their financial dependence on children. Then there's broader social changes that reduce sex selection. Urbanization is is about the most important of these, because in an urban setting, you live and work in an impersonal setting. You live in an apartment and you work in an office. You're not surrounded by your husband's patrilineal kin who are asking you every day whether you've conceived a boy or not. Also with urbanization, it's more equal whether girls or boys happen to live near their parents, because children find work in other settings. So the probability of a son or a daughter living near the parents becomes more equal rather than it's always the sons. Industrialization helps also because access to income is delinked from being a member of your particular lineage. And it also offers wider possibilities for personal savings. Then you get exposure to new ideas, education, changing social norms. And as we already discussed, the process of changing norms can be accelerated by media efforts. So what can we learn from the South Korean experience of a shift from strong son preference to daughter preference? South Korea is obviously very interesting. In these figures, it's the line in red. What you see is their sex ratios at birth were the first to go through the roof, way ahead of China, Taiwan, India, Vietnam, way ahead of them. And it was the first to come down. And you see the same pattern when you compare South Korea in red with the South Caucasus countries. And in each of these graphs, the solid blue line is the more developed regions where there's little or no sex preference. And what you see is South Korea's levels have come right down to normal levels. So it was the first to go up and the first to come down. And what you see here from the successive surveys is the proportion of women reporting that they absolutely must have a son has shot down, while the proportion of women saying they're indifferent to what sex, the gender of the child, has gone way up. And then a different set of surveys asked them, if you were to have only one child, would you prefer a son, a daughter, or are you indifferent? And you can see that those proportions went up quite substantially in the early 2010s. And this is a big shift for a country like Korea. They had a very wide, in South Korea developed at a blistering speed, and everything happened. So they had economic policies which reduced financial dependence on sons. From the 60s onwards, industrialization, mass education. Then from the late 70s, national programs were gradually put in place that reduced risk. They also had intensive mass media campaigns that encouraged people to value daughters, firstly in the context of family planning, because they didn't want people to continue having children until they had a son. And then in the 1990s, the same message was used because they didn't want people to sex select. Then they also had a whole bunch of legislation for gender equity. Gradually, the family law was changed to one in which you weren't even allowed to adopt a girl, to one in which now inheritance is equal. You can have the family name from either the woman's side or the man's side. And finally, the last nail in the coffin was that men were no longer in legal charge of their household. From 1987, there were laws passed to ensure gender equality in employment. None of this is perfect. South Korea still has very high levels of gender inequality in employment. The point is that they were trying through legislation to encourage greater equality. And the same with political representation quotas for women. And of course, they famously banned sex detection. Now, since this was happening at a blistering pace in South Korea, basically everything was happening at the same time, and in a very compressed time frame. This is just an example of the kind of saturation mass media campaigns against son preference that South Korea had. This particular one is a family planning program poster, where from the early 1970s onwards, they tried to say things like, whether it's a son or a daughter, stop at 2 and bring them up well. And the poster shows this family where they have 2 daughters, and the father is thrilled to have 2 daughters. And this kind of messaging continued in a different framework to advocate against sex selection from the 1990s onwards. What's interesting is the decline in son preference snowballed through South Korea. The odds of stating, excuse me, the odds of stating that you must have a son, it declined, as you would expect, with education, with urban residents as opposed to rural residents. But the single most powerful effect was simply the passage of time, whether the sample was from the survey year 2003 versus the survey year 1991, controlling for all these other socioeconomic factors, which basically meant that changes in social norms snowballed across socioeconomic groups. And then turning to the analysis of the shift to daughter preference, which I did with my colleague Hiran Chun. The analysis of this survey, Korea General Social Survey, it asked, if you were only to have one child, would you prefer a son, a daughter, or no preference? And the odds of preferring a daughter were higher if they were more exposed to various kinds of societal transformations, i.e. they lived in urban versus rural area, they were more educated, and they were younger. The odds of preferring a daughter were also higher if they if they report that, I'm so sorry. If they report values that are less traditional in terms of their views on gender roles, what's appropriate for men versus women, but also their religion, if they were atheist above all, but also if they were Protestant versus traditional religions. A whole bunch of studies in the literature indicate a change in the value of sons versus daughters in South Korea. Studies by Choi and Kim et al. Show that daughters provide more emotional support to parents. And Lee and Bauer find that women provide more childcare for their own daughters rather than their daughters-in-law. And at the same time, unlike other developed countries, South Korea and Japan continue to have high expectations of intergenerational support. In most other developed countries, expectations of intergenerational support are quite low, and so you can be more indifferent to the sex of your child. In the case of Korea and Japan, the support is important, and they find that emotional support from girls is more reliable. You're beginning to get studies coming out of China beginning to make the same point, but it's a very large and heterogeneous country. So it's, you don't get the same very rapid transition as you got in South Korea, which is a small and homogeneous country. So basically what you're seeing in South Korea is not just an erosion of son preference, but a shift to daughter preference. And essentially, people's needs for old age support have changed dramatically in South Korea. Financial support is much less important now. Earlier, people handed over the land when they got old, they handed it over to their sons and depended on their sons to farm the land and to support them. Now people have access to their own savings, to national health insurance and pension programs. It's a different planet that they live on. Emotional and physical support is also much more important now because Koreans have some of the highest longevity in the world, and daughters are perceived as better caregivers than sons and their wives. So what people want now from their children is, it's a really nice quote that Hiran found in a newspaper. What people now want from their children is not a bowl of rice, but tender loving care. So to conclude, sex selection is driven by cultures that force parents to depend on sons. And in these settings, sex selection rises as parents face increased risk and as parents find that the new technologies make it easier to sex select. What can change such cultures? Well, firstly, broad social changes. Urbanization and industrialization reduce the power of patrilineages, while exposure to new norms through education, mass media, and the community around you changes your norms. Specific policies for increasing gender equality can help lay the groundwork for broad social changes. And risk reduction in particular, new savings instruments, health insurance, and pensions. And this is illustrated by Korea's shift, South Korea's shift from strong son preference to a preference for girls. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Monica, for very comprehensive and illustrative presentation. So let me now turn over to the audience and to see if anyone have particular questions for Monica. You can raise your hand and I will let you ask question. Vincent?
Thanks, Pook. Thanks, Prof. Gupta. I thought the presentation was very clear, very systematic, and I learned a lot from it. So thank you very much. I have a question with regards to the conclusion being made, and I thought you stated it very poignantly that that there is a shift from son preference to daughter preference, and indeed it is not the bowl of rice in a sense, but the tender loving care that families look for. But I also detect a paradox embedded in this, because son preference would discriminate against daughters, but daughter preference would discriminate against sons. So, the pendulum swings, and in a sense, I'll be back to the same problem, but sort of expressed in a different way. I suppose the policy challenge is then to think up policy that ushers in preference for children, regardless of the gender. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that. Whether is it a case that the pendulum merely swings and that we are dealing with another gender, this time the other group, and is that a paradox? So that's my first question. If I could pose a second one quickly. So you said that the shift spreads through society and it was very fast in countries like South Korea. But I'm sure there might be differences by, I think you did mention some of this, socioeconomic groups, and there are differences in gender norms and so on, according to levels of education and so on. Can you say a bit more about whether in fact the sweeps were pervasive, or whether in fact the changes were more targeted on or that the impacts were felt more greatly for certain groups? Thank you so much.
Shall I go one question?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent. Those were really interesting questions. The first one on the paradox, what you find, there's this very interesting study in Japan by somebody called Fuse, who basically used this same kind of survey data were collected. You know, if you only had one child, what sex would you want it to be? And he showed that there was a shift. Sorry, she showed that there was a shift over time from a mild preference for sons to an increasing preference for daughters. And this is essentially the same thing that you're finding in South Korea. It's much more striking, obviously, to find it in South Korea because they had this very strong son preference, unlike Japan. But the factors that she cites, what Japanese parents say, is almost identical to what you find in the South Korean context. Basically, they start saying that, well, one problem, and that's also a paradox, is that they still want their sons to be super successful. It's not as important for daughters to be super successful professionally. So they, in both settings, they invest heavily in their son, giving them, you know, expensive private tutorials and so on. They must get the best possible education and have the best possible job. So that makes it expensive for parents, but it also, what they express is it makes it stressful for parents. And they find it much easier to raise a girl because they aren't themselves so stressed about all that. And they also find that girls are emotionally more manageable. So why don't they actually, in the South Korean context or even in Japan, discriminate against sons? I don't know, to tell you the truth. I suppose in the South Korean context, you could say it's because, you know, they've had this sense that, you know, the son continues the family line, and, you know, it's an old habit that's taking a little while to die out. But I'm not at all convinced that you're going to find that they're going to start sex selecting and getting rid of sons prenatally. I think that's a very unlikely thing to happen. I think they're just going to become more like the Japanese in terms of being essentially indifferent, but hoping that they'll have a girl.
May I interject a little bit? So did you get the chance to do sort of parity specific sex ratio? Are there such evidence? Like, you know, in the among the firstborn, what is the sex ratio, or this, you know, if they move on to the second parity, what's the sex ratio imbalance is like in South Korea?
I did, but I don't have it on this screen.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you, because the Korean statistics are on the web and they're very clear, what they show is that as the sex selection came down, the pattern was increasingly that sex selection was only in third births and above. So it was a very small proportion, and you're talking about a fertility level of 2 and below. So it's a very small proportion of parents who continue to sex select, and those were the ones who were willing to go to a high fertility level to have a son. And even that came down to practically zero now.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not
thanks, Prof.
zero,
Gupta.
but it's almost zero. Sorry?
No, I just wanted to say that I thought what you said about the case of Japan is interesting, that the sources of gender inequality basically have shifted. So preference for daughters at birth, but, you know, as life progresses, expectations shift for different gender groups. I thought that's sociologically important. That it doesn't mean that the discrimination in a sense has been removed, but rather that has shifted to a different stage of the life course.
Right.
I thought that was interesting.
Right. And maybe in the fact that women are in both Japan and Korea are much lower, are allowed to progress much less in the professional world. Maybe that also makes them freer to, they have more time for their parents. Not a good reason, but nevertheless possible. Then the second question you raised, Vincent, was about the very rapid shift in South Korea, and that's something I do have some figures on the socioeconomic factors. So this is the study that Woo Jin Chong and I did. And we found this is the odds of stating that you must have a son. And it's a pooled sample of 1991 and 2003, the same fertility surveys that were done periodically in South Korea. And you find, as you would expect, that more educated women were less likely to say that they absolutely must have a son. The role of male education, as is commonly found, it's still there, but it's not as important as women's education. You find that living in a city, in a small city as opposed to a rural area, makes a difference. You're more likely to not feel so pressured to have a son. Living in a metropolis makes it even more so. So the usual factors are all in play.
But husband is the only son is quite a big effect.
It's a huge effect, and this is something that's specific to South Korea because the eldest son is the one who was given somewhat more assets, and it was his job primarily to take care of the parents and the ancestors. So if your husband was the only son, then there was much more pressure for that man to continue the lineage, because otherwise the parents would feel that they've been left without an heir.
Yeah.
And that's a huge effect, and I thought that was really interesting. And the other interesting thing here is just the year of survey. So controlling for all these socioeconomic factors, which all go in the direction you would expect, just the fact that the survey was done 12 years later, everybody has shifted. So we thought this was really interesting.
So it seems like ideational change matters a lot. So Monica, we actually have a couple more people who would like to ask you questions. If you can stop sharing the screen, and may I invite Mujung and everyone, can you introduce yourself briefly so Monica know who you are?
Hi, Professor Alex GUPTA. My name is Zheng Mu. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Sociology here at NUS. And so my work is gender, marriage and family in China. And thank you very much for this very exciting and comprehensive presentation. I learned a lot. And I particularly find this trends in South Korea about this rising daughter preference interesting, and especially at the end of the presentation, you mentioned these several mechanisms why this is happening, particularly pertaining to these parents and their relationships with the daughter. So for example, the daughters can provide more emotional support at older ages. And so I guess I have two related questions. So basically still about this mechanism, but probably more at this early stages of this daughter's generation. And so first is that including South Korea, like many East Asian countries, has a very like a rising trends of intensive parenting and this very high education expectations for the next generation. And so, and also there has been this trend that so basically gross educational both achievement and attainment, and as well as this non-cognitive skills tends to catch up with boys and even like overrun boys. And so I'm wondering, like, I would want to like learn about your thoughts on like how would you think? So, for example, this rising educational expectations may explain this daughter preference. That's basically daughters are considered to be better students, and so may fit their education expectations better. And my second question is pretty much about the other direction of this relationship. And so as with this rising daughter preference, and so the daughters, when they become women, become wives and mothers, and they, since they were raised like being loved, being protected and well supported, and so they may also try to like assume more power and more equal like gender like division of labor within the family, the power relationship with the husband, right? And so as you also mentioned that, so basically many of those mothers, they actually may help their working daughters with their childcare and household responsibilities. So I'm wondering, like, what is your thought on these influences of this rising daughter preference on this gender inequality, both within the household as well as in the public spheres? And so to what extent do you think this has been crucial to this rising trends to women's roles in as a career women to just pursue their personal goals? Thank you very much.
So you, as I understood it, you asked first about the expectations, intensive parenting, intensive parental investment in children, and does that translate to higher expectations of daughters? I'm trying to think what to say. I mean, it's absolutely the case that in South Korea, you know, the trajectory of women entering education and employment has gone up enormously. So on the one hand, yes, but the difference between male and female professional achievement is also huge. So I'm not sure that I have a single response to your question. Does that make sense, or have I misunderstood your question?
I think, yeah, I think partly I answered my question, but I think related to this is also like about how growth. I guess it's basically this paradoxical patterns, right? And so the girls are getting educationally better than boys do in many Asian countries, but on the other hand, in terms of these gender relations within the family, when they become the wife and the mothers, or when they become a worker, right? And so this gender inequality still persists. And so I guess I'm just want to listen to your insights about how this rising daughter preference may be translated into these paradoxical patterns regarding gender inequality.
I think there's a lot of paradoxes taking place, and I'd be really interested in your insights from China, which, as I say, it's large and heterogeneous. So, you know, I read something from An Hui and Jiang Xi, and, you know, how do you put it all together? Korea is much more tractable that way, you know. And in the Korean context, it's, well, firstly, some anthropological studies started showing it. And later, people increasingly talked about it, which is that women in the sense of married women, were left to take care of the household, and the household included the household budget financially, and also the household social budget. Who do you socialize with? And so their choices were to socialize with their own family and not their husband's family. There were some very interesting anthropological accounts of this from quite a while ago. And so there's been a real shift in gender relations within the household. And this is also helpful for the husband, for the wife's parents, because they're able to keep up that contact. But I don't think the other shift, which is, parents want their daughters to be educated, and it's really nice if they go out and earn, but they really don't want their daughters to be super professionals. They want them to be women. So I can't begin to disentangle what's going on there. And if you have insights from China that, I'm beginning to pick up from the Chinese context that even though, things like pensions and health insurance are much more incipient than in China, than in South Korea, people are beginning to say, friends of mine are beginning to say. A friend of mine, he told me when his daughter was born, he was bitterly disappointed. And now his daughter is all grown, and he says, oh, she takes such good care of us. He's so pleased. And another one had only 2 daughters and, felt it was a disaster. And now he's absolutely thrilled, One lives nearby, and he and his wife, cook food and take it to them and take care of their children. And that's just anecdotal, but I'm also beginning to pick up from the literature that there's much more of this going on. So it's in a state of flux and multiple flux. It's a little bit like COVID, when one state in the US gets it, another state has none, and then, it all keeps going like that. So there's multiple flux going on at the same time. But any insights you have from that would be really, really interesting.
I agree that it's largely a selected social change, and so as you said, now the daughters increasing emotional support for their parents, and so actually there are even literature in China showing that daughters are also providing increasing financial support for their elderly parents as well, and so to some extent that shows how the daughters if they're going back to their own family, right, their marriage, and so they actually got more power, and so if they want to support their parents financially, they can. And on the other hand, at least in China, there's also studies including my own research shows that so basically Chinese parents tend to have very high expectations for their daughters' educational and career success. And so basically, if their college-educated daughters to go back to home as a stay-at-home mother, and that will be greatly disappointed to the parents. But on the other hand, I think as you also mentioned that that some of the parents, they will help their daughters to check for childcare and things, and so this is also true in China, and so the parents do want to sacrifice their own old elderly life or retiring life to for their daughters' employment and career establishment. But at the same time, this help also shows a very gendered pattern, cross generations, that basically this intergenerational help will not change the gendered division of labor within the household. That is still the women are doing the housework, right, and work, provide childcare, and the husband they can basically remain largely unchanged, but it's basically like a transmission of help across two generations of women. And so, yeah, I agree. It's quite intertwined social change.
Okay, thank you, Mujang. So we have just, probably, I mean, it's quite late for Monica. So I think I will take, since there are questions from 2 graduate students, so I would like them to have a chance to ask you question, and then I try to wrap up by 11:05. So may I invite Jeremy and Dahai to maybe ask brief questions, both of you, and then have Monica answer them all together to save time. Jeremy, do you want to go first?
Hi, Prof. I'm Jeremy. I'm a PhD student here. Just a really quick question. So you mentioned there was snowballing across socio-economic groups, and I think you showed us some results which hint at that. The survey with 10 years later, there's a big change. Could you tell us more about how this snowballing might work? How does it happen? And is it expected? Does it happen in other countries, or is it unique to Korea? Thank you.
Dahai, do you want to go ahead and ask Prof?
Yep, sure. Hi, Prof. My name is Dahe. I'm also a PhD student here. I'm more intrigued to know about parents' conflicting expectation on children's support for them. So according to patrilineal norms, sons are given the main responsibility, right? But then if I see people's perceptions right now, then they rely on their daughters more, expecting that women are in general good at caregiving. So all these kinds of like gender stereotype that women are good at care are kind of like breaking the old pattern of patrilineality. So I just wonder what kinds of, what theories are saying about this, and then what is your take on this changing phenomena? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was, when Jeremy asked his question, I was typing a request for some of Mojang's work. Jeremy, could you ask again, please? I'm so sorry.
No problem. So you mentioned snowballing across socioeconomic groups. And you showed us that, after 10 years, there was some change in the survey results. So can you tell us more about how you expect this snowballing to happen? How does the kind of changing norms transmit from one group to another? And is it unique to Korea, or has it also been observed in other countries?
I think it's been observed in other countries, and not just in the context of son preference. It's observed in terms of changing social norms of any kind. When you have messaging that tobacco is bad for your health, gradually people begin to absorb this, and it's not just the individual who's targeted with a message who gets that, but it's a communication within social groups that tobacco is bad for your health. So I think this is quite similar. It's social norms in this case would be that it's possible for women to take care of their parents. You see in the context of China, you see short videos being made showing a man really disappointed when his daughter is born, and then he increasingly takes pride as his daughter, is successful educationally, and then she gets a job, and the final shot is she's wheeling him around in his wheelchair, and he's looking really grateful. So, that's just a way of sort of messaging that girls can do it too. And in terms of whether it's, I think Dahir was asking whether it's this idea that women can also take care of people, that women are good caregivers. I think they were always viewed as good caregivers. It's just that in the past, in patrilineal societies, it was daughters-in-law who were forced to do that for people that they didn't necessarily care for. but they were put in a situation in which they had to do it, or else they would be ill-treated or thought badly of. And it just seems to be much more spontaneous when it comes to your own parents. I have a small personal anecdote. My sister managed to have a situation where when her mother-in-law was widowed, she asked her to come and live with them. And upstairs, my mother lived in a separate apartment. And she said, you know, if when I go to do the shopping, if my mother-in-law asks me to buy cabbage and I forget, she thinks, well, maybe she didn't really want to buy cabbage for me. And if my mother asks me to buy cabbage and I forget, she says, oh, well, that's just her. She's like that, forgetful. So it's, you know, it's a different kind of relationship. But it's always been women who are stuck with the caregiving. And I shouldn't say stuck with, because it's also quite a nice thing. Does that begin to answer both your questions?
Okay. Is there any final messages? I mean, takeaway messages you want to share with us, Monica? Or should I think it's 11:05 and it's late for you.
Not really, but I would very much like to read Mo Zhuang's papers.
Right.
So that would be nice if you could just email me either the references or some of the papers themselves.
Yeah, I apologize that I need to cut short. Okay, by way of wrapping this seminar, I'd like to thank Monica for sharing her work with us, and thanks the audience for your participation and your contribution to this very engaging Q&A session. And I want to remind you that next week we would have our colleague, Dr. Sun-Hu Wang from Sociology, who just joined NUS last year. He will talk about his work on flexible work arrangements and the gender division of labor, household labor. So we'll meet at our regular time, which is lunchtime next Friday. And until then, and stay safe and have a nice day. And thank you so much again, Monica. And hope to, we hope that we would be able to welcome you to Singapore at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Puk. It's great being able to learn from this audience.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you.